really glad to be here. As Gary said, the public entity partners is your work comp, your liability, your property insurance, but you're really a member of a pool of other in local government in agencies and cities that have put their money in a common fund. And my role is I'm a professional nag. It's a great job. Not many people get to do it, but I get to wander around and go, you know what you ought to do? Let me tell you what happened down the road. It's really a problem and it could get you in trouble. And that's what I want to share with you today. We have 500 members, 44,000 insured employees, and for many years our most expensive kind of claim was law enforcement liability. And that makes sense, right? Because we employ these people to go out and harass bad guys, and that makes them mad sometimes. An average law enforcement liability claim is $31,000. Our most expensive claim are claims from our own employees suing, asking the federal government to come in and rectify a toxic work environment that's made them, they feel like they've been a victim of discrimination or harassment. Average claim, $53,000. Our other most expensive claim is also something else you all do, and that's transport of medically fragile. So Gary's right. I spent a lot of time at Ethra, a lot of time nagging and encouraging, and I really do appreciate all you do. This organization is a great place to be. Here's your real services, real impact, real heart. And every person in this room was hired because you have a certain skill set. I'm guessing that every person in this room has a desire to serve because that's what this organization does. But we're all, as the Bible says, uniquely, fearfully, and wonderfully made. And those individual differences, those perspectives can sometimes create diversity because I see things one way and you may see them another. There was a old philosopher from way back in the day that said we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. Would you agree with that? And sometimes the way we see things, if we're really strong-willed about the way we see things, it can be the source of conflict. An EEOC report came out this year that looked at 10 years of work environment, and there was one common thread for harassment complaints in the work environment. One thing that was the biggest predictor of a claim to come. Does anybody want to guess what that might be? Up top, what do y'all think? What would you think could be the greatest factor in harassment claims? It's kind of interesting, but it is a homogeneous work environment. And if you think about it, that makes sense, right? If you have a work environment where everybody comes from the same place and looks the same and thinks the same and acts the same, and then you get somebody from a different culture or a different age group or a different race that comes into that environment, they may be viewed as different. And if you treat people differently, it's the grounds for harassment and discrimination. And so we've got to be careful about the way we perceive things and the way we think about things. And are we biased about things? Who in here thinks do you think you have a bias? Is there anybody in here that thinks you're not biased in some way? You think you got them? We all are. We all have our own viewpoints, and they may or may not be correct. You know, when you look at this chart, when you see a white guy and a wife beater, do you think Aryan Nation? Do you think there's a white supremacist? When you see a black man with chains, do you think he's a gang member? When you see a Hispanic guy out in the yard mowing, what do we think about that? Oh yeah. But the truth is that person may not be what we think at all, but we have a tendency to view those people in that role. And another problem, another thing that we tend to do is we have our own biases and then we try to justify them by finding evidence of that in our world, right? We may think in our mind, well, black people aren't great at technology. And so that wouldn't be a good assignment for them, or they're going to fail if they're in that type of assignment. When the truth is, we maybe have found one person who is of color that's not good at IT. but that's a global thinking, and we can't take our personal experiences and make global rules with them. And isn't that a problem in our environment right now? Same thing for sex. Do you think women aren't good or they're too emotional to be a leader? We find the one emotional woman and we put the whole gender in that box because of our biased thinking. Or age, and I'm very particular about this one. That person's too old to be creative or to do a good job. What we have to do and what we're asking you to do is to really evaluate who you are and are you thinking right? If we have good communication with in our department, are you open for somebody saying you possibly could be wrong? An interesting statistic that something I read recently was in 1968 at Commercial Appeal there was one black reporter that worked on that paper. His name was Calvin Taylor, and he was assigned to work the sanitation strike. So he went down and he observed what he observed, and Dr. King came in and he wrote from the perspective of the sanitation workers who were primarily black men. And when he turned his reports in, they called him and they said, "Hey, Calvin Taylor, you're not writing as a reporter, you're writing as a black man. And as a reporter, we can't have bias. We have to be unbiased. We just have to report the facts." And what do you think Calvin Taylor's position was? Well, your facts are the white view, and my facts are the black view. And somewhere there's a position in the middle. The article went on to say some things that were interesting, like the Commercial Appeal at that time told the location of where Dr. King was, told where he was staying. They were saying that the way that was reported may have in fact contributed to his assassination, because the white majority in that time in 1968 didn't really understand that black view. So what we've got to really do is work to try to understand each other, and from a kindness perspective, we also have to learn to kind of respect each other. I hope we can see this video from Carpentersville, Illinois. Anybody ever been here? Ever heard of it? 38,000 residents, little suburb outside of Chicago, upwardly mobile, very much like Farragut would be to Knoxville, I guess. Their city hall looks like a pretty nice place, right? Well, I want to show you a video clip of their council meeting, and I want to ask you what kind of representation it has for this town. Uh-oh, that didn't work, gentlemen. Can you give me that?
Want to hear what other people have to say?
No debate.
They shut
We don't
off
want
the
debate,
debate.
do we,
It's
in
okay
this
when
town?
they do it. And
We
when
don't want
nobody
debate
else
in this
does
town.
it. Okay.
Only when it suits certain people do we have debate in this town.
The question has been called.
Yeah, the question has been called, all right. The question is, why are you people sitting on this board? That's the question.
The question has been called. We need to take the vote.
Now, the question is, why are you people sitting on this board? Who do you represent in this community? That's the question. Who do you represent?
I guess we're sitting on here to make sure you don't ramrod everything you want.
Ramrod?
Yes.
Ramrod?
Absolutely.
Ramrod?
Absolutely.
Trustee Ritter, you are, I hate to say this, I really hate to say
No,
this.
you won't hate to say it. You'll love saying it. Go ahead, say it.
No, I really hate to say this, because you should be a person, especially a school teacher.
Right,
who
all right,
should be
call my
concerned-
employment
who
into question
should
now.
be concerned about the standards of this community.
Bill, I've listened to your lectures all night.
yeah, I know
It's
you've
been an
listened to
hour
my
of
lecture.
tonight listening to you
Yeah,
lecture us.
unfortunately, nothing ever sinks into any of you people.
I think that we already are waiting for counter actions that you requested from the state's attorney's
Yeah, don't
office.
worry, they will happen, believe me. So whether you guys
Well, why
want
are
to
we
take care of
being
this,
preemptive
or
of-
somebody else is going to do it, we could
The
clean our
question's
own house as we ought to do, but oh no, not this town, not this board, not these people.
If there was a
I hope the
recall
voters out there are
ordinance, you'd be
watching.
gone, Bill,
I hope
and
the
that'd be
voters
end of
are
it.
out there watching this, because they're going to see what kind of representation they have on this board.
If there was
It
a
is
recall,
disgusting.
And President
It
Sardo,
is
you'd be
disgusting.
gone, Bill.
President Sardo, the
You're
voters,
gone.
President
You're gone.
Sardo, the voters
I'll take the
also,
96-6 vote every day of the week.
they also know of the double standard where your police report says you threatened to kill your wife. And this is misdemeanor now.
I was
Let's
not
move on.
charged with anything,
Move
Trustee
on.
Sigwald.
That's all
I was
right.
not charged,
Move
I was
on.
not charged with
The
anything.
question's been called.
And don't you ever defame me in public.
Question's been
Unless
called.
you
It's
want to
okay
be,
for you to defame
unless you
me.
want to talk to my attorney.
Oh, please, it's okay for you to defame us, though.
No, I'm not
The
defaming
question
you.
has been called.
You guys are a
Senior
disgrace.
trustee, do I
All
have
of
the
you.
right to
From the
ask the
convict
court-
at the end
Terry.
to the woman whose
Terry.
son had sex with the convict's wife. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. What a town. What a beautiful place.
So how do you think the taxpayers of that town feel? And there is a whole series of President Sardo's council meetings that you can find on YouTube. Oddly enough, he was not reelected. But what kind of toxicity does that create, that kind of argument? I mean, and the source of, do you think you're more likely to have work comp claims at that city? You're more likely to have employment claims, and so we want to talk about
Wanna
the
hear what-
elements that really, really do help. And I want to ask each of us to evaluate your role in the organization. When people look at you, do they see a drunk kitty? Or do they see a productive, I love the cigarette out of their mouth. Just don't tell Peter or Peter or whoever they are. If you were going to hire somebody or you were going to get somebody in your department today, what characteristics would you say you wanted if somebody was coming to work for the organization and working with you? Huh? You want somebody that knew how to do what you do, right? Somebody that's competent. We want somebody that'll show up, give it a day's work. And I think we'd probably say, well, we want somebody we can get along with too. And those are the three primary things we tend to look at. But the sort of the unspoken but really equally as important characteristics are we all need to agree, and we want team members that show respect to each other and show restraint. Are we in a world today where anything that comes in somebody's head comes straight out of their mouth? And does it create toxicity? And the thing is, in our work environment, anything that exists in our work environment may be material to some kind of employment case down the road. We had a firefighter that sort of learned about respect and restraint the hard way. He was coming to work one day. He ran into a work zone. He experienced a little road rage. And he did what many people do when he came to work 10 minutes late. He got on his social media account and he said, "Those idiots in public works are going to get somebody killed. I was at this work zone for 10 minutes and I couldn't believe what I saw." This guy'd been there 8 years, a good employee by most accounts. So he was shocked a few hours later when the mayor called and said, "Turn in your gear, you're done here." It seems pretty extreme, right? And he sued because he said, "I've got the right to free speech. And I can say what I want to say." And the courts did not agree with him. The court said, "Well, you had your free speech. You just had to pay the consequences of that free speech." And that seems like a harsh reaction from that mayor for one rant. But here's what the mayor was thinking, and here's what we all have to remember. The legal avenue of suit, the legal avenue against ETHRA in every local government is the Governmental Tort Liability Act. And what it says is this. It says, if anybody in this room, if any employee or named volunteer or elected official of your organization becomes aware of an unsafe condition, then that agency's on notice that there's an unsafe condition and it needs to be corrected. What the mayor was saying is, if you're aware of a condition, and this is true too, if you're aware of some condition that could potentially cause damage or harm, you got to take it internally. We got to work within the machine to get it corrected. We don't take it out to the public and publicize we got a problem and somebody's going to get killed. You got to work within your organization. So that restraint is important for the organization. Evidently, it's also important for job longevity. How many of you have worked together for 5 years? Anybody been here 10? 20? So, and some of us, and I've been in this spot, as Gary referred to, I've been around a long time, 32 years I've done this job. In that period of time, I've worked with, my boss and I have worked together for 32 years. You know, you start to develop a personal relationship, right? Sometimes, if we're not careful, those personal relationships or the professional boundaries, the way we ought to treat each other with respect, can get blurred by long-term relationships. I was in a city one time and I was talking to this public works director about the frequency of harassment claims coming out of public works departments that was just horseplay, just slang terminology, inappropriate language. And he said, well, you know, we've got this guy that works here. He's not Hispanic, but we call him Wetback. Do you think that's a problem? And I said, yeah, I think that could be a problem. And so he said, well, we've got this Hispanic drafter coming to work next week, and so I'll take care of that, and we'll talk to the guys. And so a few, can you not hear? Is that better? A few weeks later, I got an email from that public works director, who's a great guy, and it said, the Hispanic guy's name was Jesus, which is spelled J-E-S-U-S. It said, Judy, just wanted you to know, Jesus is here. I read it as Jesus is here. And ever since he got here, things have been great. And I said, yeah, I do better when I walk with him too. So, but we've got to be careful about those personal relationships and the way we communicate with each other, that in the light of day, it looks okay. We had a special events director who was a great guy by all accounts, but he was inappropriate. And you may know somebody like this in, you know, your department. His department didn't have a problem with it. In fact, because of the nature of their work, they would work these long weekends and holidays when other people might be off. They'd work 12, 14-hour days to put on an event. And then at the end of the event, commonly their department of 7 or 8 people would go out for burgers and beers and, you know, diffuse and talk things through. Because of the nature of their work, their social group became pretty much their work group, and that's who they hung out with. The department head was a homosexual male. His wing woman, his programmer, was a heterosexual woman. So they had a common interest, and that was good-looking men. And they'd commonly text each other pictures of these, you know, guys with six-packs, and they'd give each other Playboy calendars and that sort of thing. He cared about her. He arranged for music and transportation at her mother's funeral. He threw a 50th birthday party for her at his home. Unfortunately, he chose to have a penis-shaped ice sculpture champagne fountain. Those things were okay with her at the time that they occurred. But at some point in 18 years into their employment relationship, things soured. He became dissatisfied with her work product. She didn't come to work as often as he thought she should. And so he called her in and talked to her about it. And she said, I'm filing a suit, I've been sexually harassed. Now, what material did she have to demonstrate that? Everything they'd done every day, because they had gotten used to communicating with each other in a less than professional way. They'd let those professional boundaries be blurred. And I see it over and over and over again in these suits. Everything, it's fine. Harassment's okay until you're victimized. And then all that material that existed in the work environment prior to my complaint is now material evidence. So we've really got to be careful to protect the professional boundaries of our work. Even if we really like each other and we're just joking and we're teasing, it can be problematic sometime we're down the line. What the Supreme Court has said is things of a sexual nature that aren't related to work have no business at work. So unless you're a police officer, or maybe in the probation offices you might have, I don't know, access to something that's inappropriate for most of us have no reason to have any jokes or materials of a sexual nature in our work environment. And the same thing can be said now for almost anything. It's not just things of a sexual nature. that can be disruptive, right? Is anybody else sick of the election and all the hate stuff? You know, and so it can affect us and we can bring it into work, but we're really paid to do our job here, to those services to our community. And so that's what we've got to focus on. Here's another great. We may not be number one on the football field, but guess what? Wallet Hub has ranked Tennessee as the angriest state in the nation. So we also have to be careful in that regard, right? We have to recognize that, and that's rated on domestic violence, domiciled hate groups, sexual harassment complaints, mass murderers, all kinds of great statistics. I am challenging each of us to go out in kindness and see if we can't pull us down to number 2 for next year. Okay, this is a poster for the Chicago Transit Authority. Can you see it all? I could give you my handout. What do you think about this poster? Do you agree with it? It says, if it is unwanted, it is harassment. How many agree that's true? How many don't? How many have no vote? Are you voting? You better vote this election. I'm telling you, you all need to take a stand. How many think it's harassment? Okay. Anybody not? How many want to be here right now? You know, we have kind of gotten to a mentality in our world that if I don't want to do it, I don't have to. That's discrimination if you're going to make me do my job. There are many components of my job that I don't particularly want to do, and I imagine that might be true for you too. Harassment has a high definition standard, and we're going to look at the legal definition of harassment, but it really is behavior that's so pervasive, so unrelenting, so distracting that you can't get your work done. That's harassment. It's not just every kind of little offense. It's not one joke. It's not one utterance. What our policy, your policy calls for you to do, and what we ask you to do as a reasonable person, is address something in the work environment if you feel like it's inappropriate or you feel like it's discriminatory or distracting or demeaning. But the harassment definition and what the EEOC says is harassment is a pervasive kind of work environment. The legal standard's high, but that doesn't mean that you can have a work environment that doesn't have harassment and it be professional, right? We can be somewhere in between that kind of puts us in a danger zone. The EEO, the way you find out if you got harassment or not is you can file a complaint with the EEOC. They want to know about, they'll send you a little 7-page form that you can get online that says, you know, who, what, when, where, when did this happen, how often did it happen, who observed it, what have you done about it? And you can turn that in, and at some point in time, you have to sit down with the EEOC folks and say, this is what happened to me. Now, how do you imagine the EEOC might try to validate that information? What kind of information would you look for if somebody told you there had been harassment in your work environment? A witness, okay, so they might come talk, they might ask to talk to your coworkers. Documentation for not only that employee, but for other employees too. Anything else? Have there been other complaints? That's right, and we do see a snowball sometimes if a complaint takes hold. They're going to look at things like attendance records of this person and other people, pay history of this person and other people, disciplinary records of this person and other people. They might look for emails, can you imagine if somebody wanted to see every email you had in the last 3 years about that address something? So that's one reason these claims are so expensive. We don't pay as many settlements in employment-related cases as we do in some other areas, but the investigation is very involved and very extensive and very time-consuming. The EEOC, after they get a complaint, have 165 days to gather information and make a decision on whether or not they believe that some kind of harassment or some kind of action should be taken. And they can say to the employer one of four things. They can say, we don't see anything here. They say that in 63% of the cases. They can say in 2% of the cases, they say, we do see something bad here and we're going to join in and take action. About 20% of the time they could say, we suggest you sit down with this person and try to mediate this situation. And in many cases they can say, we aren't going to do anything, but we're going to give the employee a right to sue. But you can see that those rights to sue are very expensive, and they're very expensive for the reasons I said. It takes a lot of legwork to evaluate that situation and see if this person was treated in a different manner because of their protected class. The majority of complaints we have come after some kind of employment action, their retaliation, but also and you can have, if you're wondering why these add up to more than 100, because somebody can have more than one kind of complaint, right? The fastest growing area is disability, age, and gender and race. And it's not just the federal government. There's also a state law that pretty much mimics what the federal government says is a violation of someone's rights. In Tennessee, the judgment is based on the size of the organization. The bigger you are, the greater the exposure. This particular case, Emerson Electric versus Judith Wood, involved a woman who got transferred to Tennessee with her husband. He was going to be at the base in Clarksville. So she worked somewhere, I think in Indiana or Illinois, as an engineer for Emerson Electric, and she applied to be transferred to Murfreesboro, and she was transferred to Murfreesboro. This has been a couple of decades ago, and it was highly unusual to have an engineer in that position. In fact, she was the only woman in that position. And what she found were men that weren't exactly open to her filling that role. And in fact, they said, well, we can't give you that role, but we'll let you be a draftsman. And then she was the victim of horseplay and teasing and men rubbing up against her and commenting about her physical attributes. She complained to her boss. He said, honey, you're going to have to get along. They transferred her out to another department. She had a similar experience. She ultimately had an emotional breakdown. But the reason this case is really important to us in Tennessee is that when the courts looked at it, they said, okay, Emerson Electric, you are responsible for how your employees work and treat each other. But guess what? We found 5 other individuals in this organization that we're going to ask to dig down in their own pockets and pay because they've allowed this environment to exist. Her supervisor, one of her coworkers, the HR director, because they've not addressed it, the company owner, and another worker. So, the courts do hold us all accountable for our actions. Harassment, there are many, many legal avenues of litigation that can be taken. We'll look more detail at Title VII. Age Discrimination Act, anybody over 40 can't be treated differently because of their age. Equal Pay Act relates to sex. Immigration controls, you have to be certain credentialing to be employed. And then, as I think I said, the Americans with Disabilities Act is our fastest growing area of liability, not just in employment, but in the other services that you provide, because the definition of disability is pretty broad. Harassment's not, I missed a page. In Title VII, any of these groups, if you're in a protected class, you can't be treated differently because of your sex or your age or your race or your religion or your national origin or your disability or even your genetic material. Most of us probably can climb into one of these protected classes, right? And if you can't, hang on. You'll be there just in a few years. And the truth is, most of our claims really are from a toxic work environment, and then they tag this protected area that they are in, and it really has little to do with your, the category you're in, but we have to defend the behaviors that have existed. A protected class is just a term used to say you've got to treat people equally. You can't treat one group separate in a different manner than you treat another. And sexual orientation is still a little vague on is that protected or not, but it's a little bit clearer in our circuit, the Sixth Circuit, in March of this year. There was a case that involved I think his name was Randall versus a funeral home. It was a man that was transitioning to a woman. I believe that was the direction he was going, but he'd been employed there for 3 years, and he told his boss, hey, I'm going to need a couple weeks off because I'm going to transition. And his boss said, we don't need that kind here. We don't need you here. You're it. You're done. He sued, and the court said, yes, that is discrimination based on sexual orientation. And so in the Sixth Court, it's a little clearer that and I think also when you receive federal dollars, you have to have a protection for sexual orientation. So I think it does apply to you here. Harassment, it's not just sexual, it's just workplace harassment can be a type of discrimination, and the same laws that apply to sexual harassment apply to a hostile work environment. There are two types of harassment. There's quid pro quo. We don't see much of this at all. This is where there was a bartering system. If you do this sexual act, you can get a promotion. Or the more negative side, if you don't do this sexual act, you don't get a promotion or you don't keep your job. It's a bartering system. There's some kind of sexual act traded for employment. This used to be the only kind of harassment recognized, and it was very rare that we got a suit. When hostile work environment, what happened to me, gentlemen?
City Hall,
No.
City,
No, there you go. A hostile work environment. Yeah, I'm gonna wake you up. You just wait. Shouldn't eat all that sugar. Like I said, the most common kind of claims we get are hostile work environment, and that's where, it's just so pervasive. I'm treated differently because of my category, and I'm really treated in a mean and bullied kind of way. Another Tennessee case that is a Supreme Court landmark, Harris versus Forklift Systems. I said we're number one in angry, remember? But this is a few years back too. Ms. Harris, Teresa Harris, worked in a primarily male-dominated work environment. They rented big pieces of equipment. And the president hired her for this job, but evidently he decided he didn't want a woman after he got her. And he would do things like put work orders in his pockets and make her fish them out. He'd drop things on the floor. When she picked him up, he'd talk about her physical attributes. He would interrupt her meetings with clients and say, excuse me, I've got to have Miss Harris. We're going down to the Holiday Inn to finish her performance appraisal. There wasn't anything sexual in their relationship, but there was something very inappropriate in their relationship. And the court said, yes, this is sexual harassment. This is harassment, but it's not based on that barter system. It's just a hostile work environment that's been created. And the same thing beyond sex, that hostile work environment can be created because of someone's nationality or their disability or their genetic makeup, those areas of protection we talked about. We called it, there's another slide before that video, and it's who can commit. Hey, good job. So harassment's not just what your employer did to the employee or what a supervisor did to a subordinate employee. It really can be anybody. It can be somebody from an outside agency that's making workplace uncomfortable and discriminatory. It can be abuse you're taking from a client. It can be a coworker. One of our settled claims involved 3 utility clerks that all basically did the same job. 2 women, 2 white women, had a friend in mind when the position became open, but a Hispanic woman was hired. And they didn't want her there. They wanted her gone. Not really so much, I don't think, because of her nationality, but they wanted her gone because they wanted their buddy in that job, right? So they'd run to their boss and say, she's made a mistake. There's another mistake. She's not very good. There's another mistake. The Hispanic woman went to the supervisor and said, they're picking on me. And he said, they're the way they are, and they're going to always be that way. You gotta learn to get along. This is our tagline that we can read the commonality between every lawsuit. You don't have to learn to get along if the behavior's inappropriate. They also, asked her, they spoke to her in Spanish. They treated her differently because of her culture. I don't think it started out in that case, that utility case, to go, we're going to pick on this woman because she's Hispanic. But I think the problem was they didn't do anything when she complained. They didn't look at it from her perspective, and she was treated differently. After she left their employment, an outside audit determined that she made fewer mistakes than the other two women. But that supervisor actually took their word, just assumed she was right, and a settlement was made in that situation. And another problem that we see, a common thread in these claims that could happen here, is because of isolated areas. Co-workers have to be accountable to report inappropriate behavior. If you see something, say something. We had a wastewater treatment plant operator whose name was Mike, and he had a black man that came to work for him whose name was James. And when the first day James got there, Mike said, I've never been around black people much. You're going to have to help me. Like he had some alien, from some other. And James needed the job, and he thought, well, okay, because he's smiling, it's probably all right. For 10 years, this went on where Mike really did treat James differently because of his color, and he'd say things to him like, in my family, we always believed in hanging them before, what's that saying? Some saying like, we hung them before they grew up or something. He would bring every aberrant news article that any black person ever committed and say, hey, James, would you ever do this? At safety meetings, he would bring 11 glazed donuts and 1 chocolate and go, guess which one's yours, James? James endured that behavior for 10 years until the point in time when he went to Mike and said, I want to be a certified wastewater plant operator. I want to improve myself. And Mike said, oh, James, I don't think you can pass that test. That's a tough one. The reality is 63% of the people who take that test fail it. So it's true, it is a tough test. But that wasn't what hung Mike, right? It was all that behavior. And the most difficult thing in that whole case, if you read the case file, is when the coworkers were interviewed, they all said, oh yeah, Mike was really weird around James. He was so strange around James. James got a 6-figure judgment. Mike got a retirement. Guess who the chief operator is at that plant now? James. But that organization could have been saved a lot of money if one of the people that observed that had just spoken up and just taken that position that legal liability happens when we become aware of it, when any person becomes aware of it, if they had addressed it. I think Mike, by all accounts, grew up under a rock somewhere, but he created a lot of problems in that town. We're going to look at another town, and I hope it's not going to scream at us. This is the city of Laverne. City of Laverne, over a period of 7 years, they employ about 80 people, I think. They had 21 claims. We paid out in defense costs $1.8 million, and it was because every time they'd have a claim, they'd just go, well, we fixed, those people are gone, it's fixed now. They didn't address the fundamental issues, and it created a lot of disruption. We're going to look at some of that experience now, I hope.
City Hall in Laverne.
And it comes after some pretty unsavory complaints of racism. One administrator has resigned, and the city manager, I should say, has been suspended. And not everyone thinks that that's punishment enough for what happened. Channel 4's Larry Flowers has worked for you tonight in Rutherford County.
And I rolled out. With a 3-1 vote, Laverne Mayor and Board of Aldermen decided to suspend City Manager Mark Moshe.
By putting him on 4 weeks without pay and be written up in this file.
But Alderwoman Sina Mosley didn't agree with the disciplinary action, saying it wasn't strong enough.
We need to look at the removal of this employee. If it's bad enough that it's 4 weeks without pay,
then that's bad.
Mayor Ronnie Irvin says Moshe's investigation into racial and discriminatory claims made against former Codes Director Tom Haley was lax. Former Codes Inspector and Municipal Officer Gary Dooley, who is black, filed a complaint with the city claiming shortly after he was hired, Haley and some fellow co-workers often called him the N-word. When Gary Dooley was ultimately fired from his job, he filed an EEOC complaint against the city. In this letter, the EEOC responded by saying there is reasonable cause to believe that Dooley's claim against the city were true. Also today, Human Resources Director Kathy Payne handed in her resignation. Claims were also made against Payne for the way she handled employees' complaints. Tonight, the board also voted to enter into possible settlement negotiations with Gary Dooley. I spoke with Mr. Dooley's attorney tonight, who says just because the city of Laverne voted to enter into settlement discussions with him doesn't mean they're going to agree to do it. They say they're ready to go to trial if need be. In Laverne, Larry Flowers, Channel 4 News.
There have been several lawsuits filed against the city by employees claiming everything from racial discrimination and harassment to a hostile work environment. Many of the cases were settled out of court, but last year 2 public works employees won judgments against the city in court.
Really started snowball, and what happened is that it was a white guy and a black guy that worked together, and they got irritated because the secretary would get mad, throw these hissy fits, and she'd use the N-word. She'd go, I'm nobody's, and that she commonly expressed herself that way. When these 2 guys complained to the supervisor and ultimately to Kathy Payne, the HR director, she was fired, and it started a little turf war. And that turf war escalated into behaviors you wouldn't even believe if I went into them, but nobody stopped it. And so what we're really asking of you today is just to be accountable for your agency's assets, because does anybody want this to be your agency on the 6 o'clock news? You know, several claims been filed of harassment and discrimination. It's very embarrassing. Workplace harassment is, how is it evaluated? Well, it's what would a reasonable person expect? What would a reasonable person tolerate? I don't know who your measuring rod is in here, but it's evidence, and that's another reason it's so expensive. How, frequent was it? How ongoing was it? Is it just from people who are overly sensitive? We've got to learn to communicate. If I've offended you in some way, tell me. I'll apologize. I don't want to offend, and I imagine most of you are just like that too. Most people would prefer to come to a work environment where people care about each other and there's positive feelings. We also see, if we tolerate inappropriate behavior, it's the fodder for those kind of claims to grow. And no policy in place also creates that problem. Of course, you all have a policy. It can be created by horseplay, nicknames, political arguments, inappropriate touching, little too huggy, touchy-feely. I tend to be a hugger, but I've tried to, hands off, I behave now. And just remember that things, that may be funny, and they may be funny, but if it doesn't look good in the light of day, if you wouldn't want your family to see it, if you wouldn't want to read it on the front page of the paper, it's probably not a good idea. And then we also, and it's a shame we have to say this, but we finally do, do you know any close talkers? Is there anybody in your organization that's just too close? This is a public service announcement. This is the professional distance between people. If you're here, you're too close. That's for honeys and husbands and kids. Your policy says that it won't tolerate it, that it won't tolerate general harassment or sexual harassment, and it puts the burden on you to report if you observe something. And so that's what's expected. In closing, this is what I would say to you. Our challenge, what we're really asking of you, is just to be like this big black bear, just to look at everything in your worldview the same. He says he doesn't care if you're white, black, man, woman, straight, gay, Catholic, Muslim, American, Mexican, everything tastes like chicken to him. So And we ask for you to treat people consistently. And then, I don't know, this one might date me. I guess it probably does. But, you know, also, we all have some burden we're carrying. All of us have some issues. We do want to be sensitive to each other. It says, in this case, Old Yeller. How many people have seen Old Yeller? Spoiler alert. Old Yeller's a lab who dies in the end. Letting him see the end of Old Yeller might not have been the kindest thing to do. And I don't know, do you remember this picture from Portland? This was a Black Lives Matter march. And this young man was holding a sign that said, free hugs. Now, the police officer could have been offended. He was there as a security, force for this march. And he could have been offended that this was sort of an anti-police march or police abuse march. But instead he went up to the young man and he said, can I have one of those hugs? He said, why are you crying? And he said, I'm just afraid to grow up in this world. He said, well, let me have one of these hugs. That young man was one of the kids that died in that van that went off A1A. It was two women that committed suicide and took her kids with them. But that's kind of a negative note. I'm going to not say that tomorrow, so don't tell anybody. Because I really want to encourage you to try to be a positive light out there. I love this organization. I love people that want to work to make their community better, and that's what you do. But it also encourage you, if you have any conflict or struggles within your own department, to try to address them and get them worked out, because they can really, really make a difference, doesn't it? If we come to work every day dreading who we're going to see. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Cindy, I think we're bringing it into the station on time. Do you got anything to say, Gary? Okay. Well, thank you for your attention and enjoy the rest of your day.